with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and I'm your host today for this webinar on shifting intermediaries using CCF to understand the changing role of land-grant institutions. And our presenters today are Stephen Gasteyer with the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University, and Nicole Wall with the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. If you've got questions for our presenters today, just please enter them into the chat box and we'll get those handled as they come up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, hello everyone. This is Stephen Gasteyer from Michigan State University, and I will just introduce Nicole for now, but she will come in later on in the presentation. Nicole Wall is at the National Drought Mitigation Center at University of Nebraska at Lincoln. What we are going to talk about today is how the land-grant institution participated in the development of the water-based agriculture or irrigated-based agricultural systems in the High Plains aquifer over the first part of the century, and then about what has become the role of land-grant institutions as we move forward into the 21st century, into an era where the notion that we have abundant resources to apply to production is really increasingly in question. So, moving on to the next slide. Yes. So, Rosa, do I need to tell you that every time, or can I advance it myself? I can advance it myself.
Stephen, you would advance it yourself.
Excellent. Okay. So, so there you have the goal that I already stated. That and this is really the idea is to better understand not only what has traditionally been the role of land-grant institutions, and there is a big part of this research that was historical in nature, but really then to try to look forward. How do we deal with, how have these institutions that have played a very, very important role in getting us to where we are, how are they evolving to serve the needs, a new set of needs that are based on greater constraints. Now, the context is that we are, I think it's probably not overstating it, and certainly the key institutions like the U.S. Geologic Survey is saying as much, that especially in areas like the High Plains and the Ogallala Aquifer, we are facing a growing groundwater crisis. If you've been reading the headlines from from Texas, you know that they are facing very, very severe drought and unavailability of groundwater to mitigate that drought. But this is one of the important things to recognize is that firstly, this is not something that's isolated to the High Plains aquifer in the United States or the Ogallala aquifer more distinctly, but rather is a problem that has very local consequences, but is global in nature, both in terms of its causes and its ramifications. This article by Hoekstra and Mokinen from 2 years ago in PNAS really highlights that that the problem of water scarcity internationally is connected to a problem of global agricultural flows that have developed and that effectively ship water very efficiently, often
We lost Stephen for a second. I've just upgraded Stephen Geyer, the Gasteyer the second to presenter status. Hopefully that that can get cleared up. I don't know how he got bumped down to.
Okay, can everyone hear me again? Are we doing?
Yep, you're back.
All right. So this is about. I don't know how much you missed of my discourse on the extent to which this issue of water scarcity is really a global issue and has ramifications both in terms of food security and in terms of our current agricultural system, which in some ways does a very efficient job of shipping food resources from water scarce to water rich areas in the form of what has come to be called virtual water. Now, this particular project is generally in the High Plains Aquifer area, and the High Plains Aquifer is the part of the Ogallala, is the super system for the Ogallala Aquifer system. It is one of the largest contiguous aquifer systems in the world. It covers 8 states from stretching from South Dakota to all the way down to Texas and New Mexico. It is also a very productive irrigated agricultural area that includes corn, beans, wheat, rice, cotton, livestock, sorghum, and then as derivative crops of that, and we can talk about that in a bit, sorghum, milo, and dry beans. The real problem is that the USGS acknowledges that this system has been on an unsustainable path in terms of recharge dating back to the 1930s. And we're in the process of trying to figure out how do we mitigate that while maintaining the production systems that have developed. Now, as a context for what we're going to talk about from here on out, I think it's really important to think about the overriding economic system that has sort of brought us to where we are now. Are we still having problems with hearing me? Or are things better now?
People are saying you're a little light. You might try to move your microphone a bit closer to your mouth to see if that helps.
Okay. How's that? I could also project as if I were in a conference room. I don't know.
That's louder. Yep.
Okay. Very good. So I think it's really important to contextualize this conversation of production in the High Plains Aquifer within the context of the economic system that has really been the, if you will, the driver of that production system. John Ury in 2012 published Phases of Capitalism that really looked at the production systems, from the capitalist production systems in the form of phases, and sort of about halfway through doing the archival research that was associated with this project, I came across this and felt that it actually really fit quite nicely into the phases of groundwater development that we see, at least in the area that we researched in the High Plains. The basic notion of it is that through the 1800s, we were in an era of liberal capitalism. So the notion was that individual entrepreneurs should seize the reins and should develop businesses and enterprises. You know, this of course is the Gilded Age of capitalism in the United States, going through the 1920s. You had extreme economic disparity and inequality, etc., etc. But what was important about this for the development of agriculture was the notion that this was really the settlement of the plains at this point was really about individual settlers on the western plains. As such, there were allotments that were given out. Individual farmers um, were certainly supported in terms of information, but there were very little resources that went to them. It was really in the 1930s that we saw the states get involved in constructing the infrastructure that facilitated production, both in the form of dams and reservoir systems, but also in the form of providing the organizational structure for the diffusion of things like pivot irrigation systems in the 1970s. So you had this state capitalist era that really stretched through about the 1980s, and then a more unorganized, or if you will, neoliberal capitalist system that then emerged, overlapping a bit with these state investments. In other words, one phased out and the other came in. That was less, that diminished the amount of state investment in infrastructure, and developed more decentralized management systems. And indeed, in the High Plains aquifer region, you really saw the emergence of more decentralized forms of management of key resources. And it's now that we are, Uri argues, that we're now at a period of what he's calling new millennium resource capitalism, where we're really looking at what kinds of investments can we make that will maintain the current benefits of the productive system, while also implementing systems that mitigate the damage to the resource system that may have come from the earlier production eras. So our research focuses specifically in the Republican River Basin. This is a basin that runs from Colorado through Nebraska and into Kansas. It is in the it has become an area that is heavily agricultural, a lot of corn production, largely with pivot irrigation systems. It is also a system that has become increasingly in conflict. We can see this in looking at the institutional history. You see the first expansion of settlement into this area and implementation of the early surface water irrigation in this area in the 1880s. What is notable about the production, attempts to irrigate starting in the 1880s through the early 1900s, is that efforts to implement irrigated agriculture in these areas really did not succeed until through the 1930s. And one of the consequences of that was, and I should step back, a big part of that expansion into this settled area was moving out the Pawnee Indian, who were settled within the Republican River Basin, and actually were very well settled there. They cooperated a good bit with the settlement authorities when they came in part because they had a history of battles with the other tribes in the area, but were eventually moved out through various Indian resettlement acts. One of the things that the settlers did against the advice of the Pawnee was to move ever farther into the floodplain of the Republican River Basin, thus leading to, along with the runoff that came with the Dust Bowl, the conditions that led to the 1935 Republican River flood, which at the time was one of the most expensive floods in U.S. history. It was very damaging, led to many deaths, as well as significant property damage. The significance, though, is that 1935 was, of course, the height of the New Deal, and the federal government was willing then to invest in flood control dams. And those flood control dams both contained turbines to power rural electric and contained the organizing structure for irrigation districts, which it turns out was really when irrigation in this area took off. And that once you had dams on this river, you had a regulated river, and the compact was signed in, or was basically developed over the period of the 1940s and 1950s. And the compact was the basis for the conditions that exist in the basin at this point, which is that Kansas became increasingly concerned that because of irrigation they were not getting their downstream flows, sued, and the 2002 ruling by the Supreme Court is the first acknowledgement in U.S. law of a connection between groundwater and surface water. But interestingly, was resolved through a process of interstate modeling to try to determine the form of easing the conflicts about water use. Now, to understand the documents we were looking at, I think we should note methods here. We spent significant time going back through extension and land grant experiment station annual and semi-annual reports to identify the activities that land grants were involved in through the 20th century, and then to look a little bit through what documents existed at what land grants are involved in now. We also read accounts of growth of agricultural production and irrigation over this period. We then carried out listening sessions in the Republican River Basin to gather from farmers and other stakeholders the perspectives on what has been the role and what should be the role in helping to facilitate productive activity in the Republican River Basin. To conceptually organize what we were looking at, we used the community capitals framework as a heuristic device. Specifically, what we did was to use this as a way of organizing the kinds of activities that institutions and people were involved in. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Community Capitals Framework is, it was developed by Cornelia and Jan Flora through the 1990s. The notion of the Community Capitals Framework is that development activities involve investments and flows of assets over time. And those assets, as you can see, this is a Venn diagram. Assets are connected and interconnected, and they lead. And the change in those particular assets, capitals, investments, can change what happens in a particular place. The assets are organized in 7 categories. So we have the normal things that we think about in development, financial and built capital. Those are financial resources, income, wealth, security, civic investment, built capital, water systems, sewer systems, housing. But then we also think about natural capital, which is to say, what are the natural resources that are available and how are they utilized, and political capital, what are the connections to political institutions to bring in resources, and then social capital, human capital, which we talk about a lot in the conventional development area. That's the development of skills, knowledge, and ability. But then social capital and cultural capital, which we believe are critical. So who is connected to whom, effectively, is the question of social capital, and what is the capacity for those connections. Um,
Well, we lost Stephen again. We've re-upgraded him to presenter, so hopefully he'll be back. I'm not sure why he keeps getting bounced.
yeah, am I back again? Can you all
You're
hear me?
back. You're back.
All right. So last but not least is cultural capital, and that's really cosmovision. It is, for lack of a better word, worldview, right? How do you view the world? What are the mental models that one uses to organize what one should be doing, with the taken for granted notions of what is good in the world? So, using that as our cultural framework, one of the first things that we came to the conclusion of was we needed to understand the paradigms that undergirded the discussion of what institutions were doing. And from the 1880s really to the early 1990s, we argue that if you look at the underlying paradigm and divide it using these capital frameworks as a model, we can see maximized yield is really the primary cultural value through this period. Now that begins to diminish in the 1970s, but really continues to be part of the prevailing discourse even up through the late 1980s. You have a real focus on relationships among producers, and consideration of sort of parochial individual systems of production. And the investments in political capital are really around incentivizing ongoing increasing yield, and doing that through extractive use of resources, and really using those extractive use of resources, water in particular, as a way of mitigating natural climate variation, natural mitigation, variation, precipitation in the area. And last but not least, we really see human capital investments in the skills both to produce for the commodity system and to understand the financial part, the commodity markets. We see, starting in the 1990s, through the first part of the new millennium, those paradigms are really shifting. And so we're, rather than just looking at productivity, we're now thinking about maximizing water use efficiency. There's a lot more effort on how do we bring people together to think about how to maximize water use efficiency, but also production efficiency. And that while the incentivizing of yield has not gone away, there is greater attention, especially in this area, on both the potential conflict with downstream users in production, and on mitigating those conflicts over time. And then in terms of human capital, we see the addition to managing systems and understanding commodity markets to added to that understanding climate variation, and then in this particular case also understanding the details of litigation and legal strategies to maintain water rights. So where does that that leaves us in terms of the role of institutions. What we really saw was the public institutions playing this role through up through the 1980s of, on the one hand, organizing the facilitation of technologies that would maximize production, and on the other hand, perpetuating a cultural capital, a cultural bias towards feeding the world, and really organizing society around facilitating technology. Now, the private sector was always part of this. The private sector was always meant to be the implement, dealer, and deliverer of technologies that would help in this maximization of production. What we have started to see is the emergence of different roles. So the private sector has increasingly taken over both the role of producing technologies, but also the role of advising producers about how to use technology. So extension has receded from that role, but where extension is now engaged is increasingly in producing the technologies that can help to think about the broader environment, and in helping to produce the dialogues about how do we address this larger problem of climate variation and possibly scarcity. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, who will tell us a bit about specifically what's going on at UNL in this regard.
Hi everyone, this is Nicole Wall from the National Drought Mitigation Center. I just want to make sure that you all can hear me all right. I'm assuming that you can. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how things are now shifting and becoming very busy as far as ag production to a more sustainable production system. As you can see on the slide, multiple institutions are now involved in encouraging mitigated productivity. So what you're seeing is a lot of state water office projects partnering perhaps with land grant universities to work on water projects. I know that Stephen has been involved in several grants at MSU looking at water in the Republican. Stephen, that was through an NSF grant, is that correct? I don't know if he's muted or not.
Yeah, that's right. So we got money.
Did you want to mention?
Sure. Well, we've had two different NSF grants that look specifically at water in the Republican River Basin. One that looked at it from a coupled systems perspective, but the emphasis was on modeling. And then the second grant was a broader High Plains Aquifer System grant. Again, the emphasis is on modeling and developing modeling new models that depict the interaction between production systems and climate change.
Thanks, Stephen. And here at the NDMC, we've worked on several NOAA and USDA grants, specifically most recently a SARE grant that one of our colleagues, Tanya Haig, secured that addressed drought planning on the ranch, and I'm going to mention that a little bit more in a few slides related to a recent discussion that we had in Garden City, Kansas. And then also I should mention some institutes that have popped up, such as the Water for Food Institute and other private industry efforts as well. I think one important thing to mention here, if you've kept up in the news, and this should be on everyone's radar, is the latest $1 billion purchase of the Climate Corporation by Monsanto. And basically the Climate Corporation has established a trove of data to help farmers cope with these severe fluctuations in weather caused by climate change. And the way that they are presenting the information is very similar to how Google organizes and presents information as well. With that purchase by Monsanto, I've learned that it will still function independently, but it's speculated that this information obtained, hopefully, what they're hoping is that, and there's already discussions about how this will play out, is that the data that they receive from producers on the ground level will be very tailored as to perhaps what they plant in the future and how much irrigation water that they will need to apply. So this should be a very interesting thing that we all should be made aware of and watching those developments. The NDMC has been involved in providing climate information and tools for stakeholders, and specifically for their drought planning for many years. As you can see on this slide, I need to advance the slide over here. The Drought Impact Reporter is one of our tools. It's a database that stores specific drought impact reports from across the nation. We're trying to kind of build the citizen science efforts into this tool. And what it does is that it categorizes these reports into very sector-specific categories like ag, public health, water. You get the picture. And then to the right is our U.S. Drought Monitor that hopefully all of you have been aware of for many years. And this map is produced on a weekly basis through collaborations that we have with USDA and NOAA. And the point here is that the Drought Monitor is very relied upon now. It really didn't start that way, but now it seems that the nation and a lot of stakeholders really keep up to date on a weekly basis to learn about what the current drought status is like here in the U.S. And I heard in November that stakeholders in Montana pay attention to it for market purposes as well. So I mentioned the USDA SARE grant and our work with ranchers, and this was a news clipping from a recent workshop that we helped organize and facilitate in Garden City, Kansas a couple weeks ago. We had over 100 ranchers and crop producers in attendance talking about how to recover and plan. Thank you for advancing the slides. Talking about how to recover and plan for future droughts. It was a partnership between NIDIS, which is the National Integrated Drought Information System, KSU, Kansas State University, and our USDA SARE partners. We had presenters from the Kansas and Colorado water offices giving kind of the latest updates in water and what's going on at the local level. And then also on this slide is an upcoming venue that we will be helping organize with others here at UNL, the Center for Great Plains Studies and also the Water for Food Institute. And it's a symposium on drought and its impact on the lives, cultures, and landscapes in the Great Plains. And it will be April 1st through the 4th. It will be here in Lincoln, and we'd like you all to attend if you can. There'll be a lot of great speakers and then also research presentations taking place. Let me go back just one slide. This was a project that I worked on with the Public Policy Center and then also the College of Law. Anthony Schutz, who is also a co-PI on this project that we've been working on. And Anthony and I served as co-facilitators for the Republican River Basin Water Sustainability Task Force, which is a very long and daunting task. And this was on the Nebraska side. And we worked with a group of stakeholders, 26 members, representing different sectors from NRD offices to crop producers, both surface and groundwater crop producers. We had somebody on the school board in the area on this task force. And so for 2 years, we worked with them to develop a goal of water sustainability, and also help them set the steps forward into making recommendations on how to avoid future water shortages in the basin. And we finalized that work in May of 2012, and much of the work that Anthony did really helped us in this grant proposal and this project as well. And I should also mention that Cody Knutson is also a co-PI on this grant that we've been working on, and he's here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. And here we have the final slide that I'll talk about, and this is just showing another effort here at the university called the Water for Food Institute. I won't go into it too much, but there was a very large donation of money given to basically develop research and strategies on how to feed the world with less water. And every year they have a conference. The next one will be in Seattle, and I wanted to point out that the topic, it's October 19th through the 22nd. The theme this year is Harnessing the Data Revolution, Ensuring Water and Food Security in a Digital World. And so I think that that is very timely and you know, really plays into what we've been doing within this research as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Stephen to finish up.
So, so can people hear me again?
Yep.
Okay, good. So stepping back and making sense of this, really we can understand there's first a methodological point, which is that we really think that the community capitals framework helps us to try to organize what it is that's happened historically over time in an area like the High Plains Aquifer. And what we're really seeing is a transformation of a system a government system that was really heavily focused on human capital to facilitate the transfer of built capital to private actors who then produced agriculture, to a system that's a government system, the land grant system, that's really now in a much more facilitative role. Yes, there is transfer of information, but you can see by this example of what the University of Nebraska at Lincoln is doing, is that the role of the public institution is more about rather than a collaboration with the private sector to facilitate the transfer of capital, it's really about it's about collaborations in multiple directions to facilitate discussions. So what we're seeing is much more a focus on built financial and human capital that and moving from this system that made sense when what we were doing was serving cultural capital that was really about productivism, about production to feed the world, to a system that's much less about individual technologies and much more about facilitating a transformation towards something that's much more integrative. At the same time, I think that the question is whether the land grant institution, how the land grant institution adapts to the growing privatization of information as well as capital flows. So with that, I think Nicole and I would love to have a discussion for as long as we can manage it with you all online today. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Well, that's great. Thanks a lot. It's a very interesting topic, and it's nice to kind of see how this is shifted with one particular set of issues over time. As you were talking, some of the questions I thought of while others type are you have a watershed, and over time, so you're already sort of crossing state lines with the watershed, right? And over time, the ownership as you know, maybe become more fragmented, where you have, you know, used to have all the owners really living on or near the watershed, and now you've got owners that might be, well, they might be in Asia, you know, they might be somewhere else, and so they've got their interests, and so how does a state-based institution deal with that issue of, you know, sort of globalization of the stakeholders?
Yeah, Nicole can pitch in on this as well. I think what is very interesting are the attempts of the state institutions to deal with this. The Doherty Center is a really interesting example because it's a center for water and food, but it's explicitly meant to be international. And you see land-grant institutions across the United States setting up centers for global research, and I think that is a reaction to exactly exactly the patterns that you've identified. That ownership of the agricultural production system could be anywhere in the world now, and it's increasingly the case that we're finding farmers who are global in nature. So that's one way, is that there's this explicit acknowledgement that we can't just be focused on one watershed or one state, but rather we need to be focused on on global systems and interactive systems.
Good. And Cornelia had a comment. I don't know if you want to comment on her comment, and also I pulled in the webinar evaluation if people could fill that out as they're listening and thinking about questions.
So Neil's comment is, as Extension has less of a role in advising in production technology, which is now all proprietary, moving this role seems particularly important. And I think she's absolutely right. That the reality now is that private actors have really taken over the role of delivering technology. I will note that one of our focus groups, there was a real, or listening sessions, there was this real sense that the role of the land-grant institution now should be more about filtering all the information that's out there and helping farmers and producers and stakeholders in production areas to make sense of all the information that's coming at them, as opposed to delivering new information to them. And I think that there's something in there that's important. Now the question is, how do you play that role as the filter? I think the risk is that you end up doing the classic. The risk is that you end up doing the sort of classic government mistake, is that you write the memo to make sense of the three other memos that were supposed to guide you in doing something. But I think we do see the efforts by the National Drought Mitigation Center to try to take disparate information and to put it into some kind of system that can be easily understood and make sense of both local knowledge and national knowledge, at least about meteorology.
Yeah, well, it seems like one of the challenges too, you know, you talk about all these information channels, is that increasingly people self-select into a particular channel, and so they may not get the other channels. You know, you could have one set of individuals who are only tuning into something that's maybe extremely conservative, and another set that may be looking at extremely liberal points of view, and others are, you know, kind of looking at the media more centrist, and yet not really kind of hearing the argument of the other side. So we're increasingly fragmented that way. And how does the land grant sort of sort that out?
That's a really good question. I think um, I I think these listening I think things like the Garden City meeting that Nicole mentioned is one way to do that. That the land grant still has the credibility to convene varied stakeholders in a way that is not deemed to be confrontational and threatening. And so that may be a way to bring disparate voices into the same room to talk about issues like sustainability that if done by other actors could be much more contentious. And it may be a way then to get actors listening to each other and not just listening to the same sources of information reiterated over and over again. I don't know if Nicole wants to comment further on that since she's actually done some of those things.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I think that's a good point about the stakeholders and how we try to centralize and communicate the climate science and in a way that stakeholders feel ownership. And one thing I'm very concerned about is this whole, and I'll bring it up again, this whole climate corporation, and just hearing about how, farmers and producers are very hesitant to give out personal information and data. And, and that's something that here at the center that we try not to do. We try not to, I guess, pressure our stakeholders into giving us, a lot of information that they feel uncomfortable with. And so it's a very interesting time. And, we heard stakeholders up in Great Falls, Montana, that are very hesitant about, giving out specific numbers and data sets to certain research efforts. And so I don't know, Stephen, if you want to follow up or if anyone else online wants to comment on that, but it's just a very interesting time, and that the Water for Food Institute and what they're going to be discussing at the next conference in Seattle, I think will play on this a bit too.
Well, I think this whole information sharing thing is quite interesting, really. There's what you described, Nicole, and then at the same time, it seems like there's people are willing to give quite a lot if there's even the smallest little personal benefit associated with it. So think about loyalty programs at grocery stores where people are willing to give that grocery store owner information about everything they buy and credit history and telephone numbers and everything that can then be linked into all kinds of different databases from partner institutions in exchange for a few cents off on a can of soup. So so there's an increasing concern about privacy, but on the other hand, they're willing to give it away for very little. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of attitudes. So maybe it's maybe the extension role would be to kind of produce an app or something like that where people input their information and they get something sort of useful back out of it, kind of like the old farm records programs used to be.
It's I think there is here. Am I back on?
Yep.
It's that's an interesting point because I think what that tells us is that there's still very much a role for engineering and new engineering and information technologies at the land grant institution. So it's not just facilitating discussions. There is there is a role for new kinds of technologies that can facilitate this integration that goes on. And yet at the same time, it's going to be this constant negotiating process, figuring out what is important to stakeholders, how do we work with stakeholders to get them the kinds of information that will facilitate a transition to more sustainable systems over time.
And Neil had a couple of points there too. You know, one I think was quite similar to what I was saying, and then also wanted to know if people in these programs understand what they're giving away when they're working with a private sector group, giving their information to a private sector group. And I think maybe at one level they do know that, but maybe not to the extent that it may be being used more thoroughly than they know, I guess would be my question, my guess, I guess, but that's just a guess. And Nicole brings up a good point about the IRB. You know, we can't take information for one purpose and then use it for a different purpose, and so we do have to be careful about those kinds of things. So consent is important.
Well, and again, that can be part of the assurance that you go to people with. You're not going to get from Monsanto's climate system, right? They will probably give you no assurances that they're not going to take your.
Well, you know, I think we've seen instances out there in the social media world where, you know, companies have changed their policies. You know, so they've promised one set of behaviors and then found it convenient to employ a different set of behaviors. So they changed their policy, and it seems to apply to all of the old information as well as the new information.
Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank both of you for being on today, and an interesting set of topics, and a lot to think about moving forward as we try to modernize the land grant system.